Good day, students. Welcome back to your virtual biology lesson, brought to you courtesy of IOTA Virtual Learning. In our last lesson, we discussed about the peripheral nervous system. We looked in details the types of peripheral nervous system: parasympathetic, autonomous, and somatic nervous system. We look at parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. We'll continue our lesson today by looking at nervous transmission. So in this lesson, what are you going to be learning? At the end of this lesson, you should be able to describe the process of transmission of impulses in neurons. You should be able to describe chemical and electrical transmission of impulses. You should be able to distinguish between voluntary and involuntary actions, describe a simple reflex arc, explain the conditioned reflex as a learned behavior, and lastly, distinguish between conditioned reflex and reflex action. Before we go into details explaining the process of nervous transmission through the nerves, let us liken it to what we see around us. So, imagine a neuron like an electric wire. Let's say you are in a room and you press the switch to turn on the light. What happens? The electric current travels through the wire from the switch to the bulb. The bulb gets the signal and lights up. Now, think of your body like that electric system. Neurons are the wires in your body. They carry messages, that is, impulses, instead of electric current. These messages are signals from your brain or senses, like move your hand, ouch, that's hot, run away. Just like electric wires are connected, neurons are connected end to end in a long chain. Now, here is how the messages move. When you touch something hot, a sensory neuron picks up the message like a sensor. This message, which is an impulse, travels down the neuron as a tiny electrical signal, just like the current in a wire. When it reaches the end of that neuron, it can't jump across like the normal electricity. It needs help. So, a chemical messenger called neurotransmitter is released into the small gap, which is called synapse. This neurotransmitter carries the message across the gap to the next neuron. Then the signal continues like a baton being passed in a relay race until it reaches the brain or the muscles, as the case may be. So in short, neurons should be likened to wires, impulses are the electrical signals, and synapses are the gaps between wires, and neurotransmitters are the messenger that help the signals jump this gap. Why this is cool, just like flipping a switch can light up a room, your neurons let your brain control your body to, in real time, sending signals at the lightning speed. Now let's go into details the process by which neurons transmit impulses. The mechanism of transmission of impulses through a nerve fiber can be categorized into three phases, which include the resting potential, the action potential, and the repolarization phase. The transmission of nervous impulses involves fiber transmission, which, as we said earlier, is electrical. But it also involves transmission through the synapses, which is chemical. Now let's look at these processes one after the other. The resting potential. The resting potential is the stage when no impulse is passing through the fiber. Liken it to when there is no electric supply in the house. A nerve fiber is electrically polarized with a positive charge outside and a net negative charge inside the cell membrane. There are more potassium ions inside than outside, and more sodium ions outside than inside the membrane. The action potential. When a dendrite receives a stimulus, just like when you turn on the switch on the wall of your house, the beginning of the axon is stimulated. The part of the axon becomes temporarily depolarized by the inward flow of sodium ion and outward flow of potassium ion. This stimulates the adjacent part of the axon, which in turn become depolarized. As this process continues, depolarizations occur from one end of the axon to the other. The nerve fibers is then said to be in an action potential. The third phase, repolarization phase. Before the onset of repolarization phase, the inner side of the membrane of the nerve fiber is electropositive relative to the outside. But soon after the transmission of the impulse, as a wave of repolarization, the resting potential is re-established. The transmission of nerve impulse is unidirectional and obey a certain law that we call all or none law. The all or none law states that if the intensity of a stimulus is below a definite threshold, the nerve fiber is not stimulated at all. But if the stimulus is up to or above the threshold, the nerve fiber is stimulated to a full potential. Let me explain this using electric current. You know, when you have a low supply of electric current in your houses, your bulb may not be fully lightened up until you have a sufficient amount of current supply from the electricity. That is when your bulbs will be fully lightened up. However, in the case of nervous transmission, if the impulse, that is the electric current, is not up to the required threshold, the nerve cells are not stimulated at all. That is, if it is the bulb, for example, in your house, the bulb will not come up at all. That is what the all or none law is trying to explain. However, if the nervous impulse is up to or above the normal threshold, the nerve cell is stimulated to a full potential. Now, I said earlier that the transmission of impulses through the nerves is both electrical and chemical. Now let's look at the chemical transmission, that is transmission of impulses by chemical means. Nerve impulses across a snap is called chemical. When a nerve impulse, that is an electrical signal, reaches the end of a neuron, which is the nerve cell, it can't jump directly to the next neuron or muscle. Instead, it crosses a tiny gap called synapse. Here is what happens step by step. The electrical impulse reaches the axon terminal of the first neuron. After this, it causes chemicals called acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter, to be released from small sacs called vesicles. The neurotransmitter then moves across the synaptic gap. They then bind to the receptors on the next neuron or nerve cell. This triggers a new electrical impulse in the next cell. After that, the neurotransmitters are either broken down by enzymes called cholinesterase or taken back to the first neuron. This process is called reuptake. So, the synapse is ready for the next message. Now let's take a look at reflex and voluntary actions. Reflex action. A reflex action is an involuntary or automatic action in response to stimulus initiated by impulse initiated by a stimulus. In other words, reflex action is a rapid or quick response to stimuli which are not consciously controlled by the brain. It is fast, inborn or instinctive, and stereotyped. A given stimulus always produces the same response. Characteristics of reflex action. Reflex action is a response without prior thought or planning because its actions terminate in the spinal cord. It is not under the control of the will or it is automatic. It is a quick response. It is entirely stereotyped in nature. For example, we don't have 2 or more responses to touching a hot object. The only response to touching a hot object is for the muscles of your hand to withdraw itself so that you withdraw the hand from the hot object. It involves minimum number of nerve cells. Then lastly, it terminates at the spinal cord. Examples of reflex actions include blinking of the eyes, jerking of the knee, salivation, coughing, peristalsis, secretion of glands, withdrawal of hand from a hot object, beating of the heart. Voluntary actions. Voluntary actions are responses to stimuli that are consciously controlled or coordinated by the brain. In other words, voluntary actions are actions taken deliberately, involving the exercise of the will or the brain. Characteristics of voluntary actions. It involves prolonged response. Its response is controlled by the brain. Its response to a particular stimulus may vary. It involves many nerve cells. Examples of voluntary actions include writing, dancing, eating, driving, singing, walking, running, reading, typing, and so on. Now, what are the differences between reflex and voluntary actions? I'd like you to take a pen and jot down at least 3 differences that you have learned between reflex actions and voluntary actions. Let's look at it together. In reflex actions, actions are initiated by muscle receptors, while in voluntary actions, actions are initiated in the brain. In reflex action, actions occur unconsciously, while voluntary actions occur consciously. Reflex actions are automatic and fast, while voluntary actions are neither automatic nor fast. Reflex actions are inborn, while voluntary actions can be learned. In reflex actions, nerve impulses do not reach the brain, while in voluntary actions, nerve impulses reach the brain for interpretation and necessary response. A reflex arc is the pathway that a message follows when your body reacts quickly to something without thinking. For example, pulling your legs away from something hot, or closing your eyes when an object is about to enter. It is a fast and automatic response to protect you. Here is how it works. A stimulus like hot surface is detected by a receptor, for example in your skin. The receptor sends an electrical message along a sensory neuron to the spinal cord. In the spinal cord, the message is passed through a relay neuron. Then it travels along a motor neuron to an effector, usually a muscle. The muscle contracts or withdraws itself, and you are able to remove your hand away from the hot object. This all happens very quickly without needing to involve the brain at first. That's why it is called a reflex. Now, apart from reflex and voluntary actions, we also have what is called conditioned reflex. Conditioned reflex. Conditioned reflex is a learned response or behavior after birth. Once they are acquired, they can be performed without thinking about them. Let's put it like this. It is a combination of reflex and voluntary actions. They are voluntary actions, but they have become reflex because we don't think about them before performing those actions. Now, most of our behaviors are actually conditioned reflexes. Examples are walking, driving, reading, writing, swimming, and so on. Now, it takes fairly long time to learn each of these skills, but once you have learned and mastered them, they are performed very fast and efficiently without a need to think about them. So they become an habit. Behavior conditioning was first described by a Russian scientist called Ivan Petrovich Pavlov in 1902. He got this from his experiments with dogs. Naturally, a dog's mouth becomes wet or begins to salivate when it is presented with a food due to reflex action. But in one of the experiments of Ivan Pavlov, he rang a bell just before giving the dog its food. So every time he is about to feed the dog, he rings the bell first and presents the food thereafter. After a long time, the dog learned to associate the ringing of the bell with the presentation of food. So the dog registered this in its brain that whenever its master rings the bell, he is about to present the food. So the dog began to salivate even to the ringing of the bell before the food is being presented. Pavlov called this response a conditioned reflex. Now, conditioned reflex play important role in our behavior. Number one, it helps individuals to acquire new skills through the learning of such habits. It helps to develop certain behaviors which are not originally shown in that individual. So, for example, if you have not been an aggressive person before, you could become aggressive and display aggressiveness as a reflex action by constantly learning this behavior. Now, in like manners, unhealthy behaviors like smoking, drinking, and drug taking may become a bad habit when they are acquired through conditioned reflex, and they may be very difficult to stop. Lastly, the principle of reflex action is used in the training of dogs for their special role in crime detection, hunting, and for security. Let's look at the differences between reflex action and conditioned reflex. Reflex actions are inborn. They are inborn behaviors, while conditioned reflex are learned behaviors. Reflex action take a short time, while conditioned reflex takes a longer time. In reflex action, it involves spinal cord and relayed to the brain after such action is completed, while in conditioned reflex, it is controlled entirely by the brain. Lastly, actions in reflex action start by muscle receptor cells, while in conditioned reflex, action starts in the brain. Now let's test our knowledge on what we have learned so far by answering past questions from our WAEC. The first question we are going to look at is from WAEC 1997, question 19, and it says, which of the following is an example of a reflex action? A. Sneezing. B. Biting. C. Dancing. And D. Singing. The correct option is option A, sneezing. Option B, which is biting, option C, dancing, and option D, singing, are all voluntary actions, or we can call them conditioned reflex. The next question is from WAEC 2000, question 27, and it says, the simple form of nervous pathway which link receptors with effectors is known as the A. Relay neuron, B. Reflex arc, C. Motor nerve, and D. Sensory nerve. What do you think is the answer? The correct option is option B, reflex arc. The reflex arc is the simple form of pathway through which a nerve receives an impulse and it is being transmitted to an effector. Relay neuron, option A, motor neuron, which is option C, and sensory nerve, which is option D, are all types of neurons. So they are wrong options. The next question is from WAEC 2005, and it says, reading of the verdict of a case by a judge or magistrate is an example of A. Reflex action, B. An instinct, C. Conditioned reflex, and D. A voluntary action. Look at these options and pick your answer. The correct option is option C, a conditioned reflex. Reading is a conditioned reflex. We learn how to read over the years and it becomes part of us. Option A, which is reflex action, is wrong because we involve our brain in reading. It is also not an instinct and it is not a voluntary action because we learn how to read. The next question is from WAEC 2012, question 17, and it says, impulses are coordinated towards the nerve cells through the A. Myelin sheath, B. Dendron, C. Axons, and D. Synaptic nerves. What do you think is the answer? The correct option is option C, the axon. The axon is the part of the nerve cell that conducts impulses towards the nerve cell. The myelin sheath, which is option A, is wrong. It acts as an insulator to the axon. The dendron are also wrong, while the synaptic nodes are the point where the axon of one nerve cell meets with the dendrite of the other or the next nerve cell. The next question is from WAEC 2018, question 16. Which of the following statements about the response of neuron to stimulus is correct? A. Neurons respond to stimulus of any strength. B. Neurons respond to all stimuli applied in rapid succession. C. Neurons respond more rapidly during the absolute refractory period. And D. Intensity of stimulus must reach a threshold before the neuron can be excited. What do you think is the answer? The correct option is option D. The intensity of stimulus must reach a threshold before the neuron can be excited. This is what the all or none law talks about. The next question is from WAEC 2016, question 17, and it says, which of the following action is not a voluntary action? A. Stealing. B. Sneezing. C. Fighting. And D. Cheating. Which of these are not or is not voluntary action? The correct option is option B, sneezing. Sneezing is not controlled by the brain, so it is not a voluntary action. However, option A, which is stealing, option C, fighting, and option D, cheating, are all voluntary actions. They are actions that we think about before we perform them. That will be all for this lesson. Thank you for your rapt attention. And please try to find out more questions from your past WAEC so that you can test your knowledge on the topics that you have learned so far. Till I come your way next time, keep on reading, for readers are leaders. I remain your biology tutor, Mr. Kehinde Adeshino, and this lesson is brought to you by Iota Virtual Learning. Bye.